professor, physician, epidemiologist. I am Dr. Sri Banerjee. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sri Banerjee, core faculty for the College of Health Sciences and Public Policy at Walden University, and I wanted to go over this specific methodological brief. I've actually never recorded a methodological brief, so this one's in particular, which was created by Patricia Rogers at UNICEF. I wanted to go over, and that specifically is the theory of change. Interesting theory, and it's actually in some ways compared to the logic model, but not quite exactly like the logic model. The logic model is more good for identifying interventions, identifying what the interventions are. If you think about the theory of change is better at looking at kind of causal, at looking at why interventions are appropriate and essential and whatnot. So this goes into the methodological brief a little bit more detail. We begin with this first figure, looking at the inputs and the outputs and outcomes and impacts. So it's going all the way from implementation strategies, assumptions and risks, outputs, assumptions and risks, outcomes, and then impact indicators. So this is kind of the big picture for the theory of change, but going further inward into the theory of change. So this is using an example. And the specific example that this is using is a multi-country evaluation on increasing access and equity in early childhood education. And so UNICEF, and there's other actors, of course, in this, but then some generic theories of change, some core rules, policy advice, and technical assistance, and then national sort of dialogue for child-friendly social norms, and then leveraging resources from public-private sector. So this all then somehow connects to the determinants, and then the bottlenecks being addressed, and those might be societal norms, a policy legal framework, budget expenditure, governance, management coordination, availability of essential materials, financial access, availability of adequately staffed services, cultural practices and beliefs, continuity of use, quality of services. So these lead to the impacts, and these may be impact, increased participation, ideally in early learning, early education, improved early learning outcomes, and then so these are the impacts. So that's an example of how a nice theory of change might follow. So if it's an impact evaluation, then the theory of change is useful for identifying the data that is needed to be collected, and how they should be analyzed. So framework should be available in advance. So this tells you when it should be used. Any sort of impact evaluation, honestly, this should be a building block for any impact evaluation. And so this goes into, there's a glossary in here which you might want to refer to. So when there's an evaluation that provides information about the impacts produced by an intervention, it can be undertaken of a program or policy or upstream work such as capacity building, policy advocacy, and support for an enabling environment. So it goes beyond simply looking only at goals and objectives to also examine unintended impacts. So is basically the theory of change. There's some other figures that goes through this really well, and then there's some ethical considerations here. So first of all, looking at how to use theory of change for an impact evaluation. So if you want to use theory of change for impact evaluation, there's several ways. So it can identify specific evaluation questions in relation to those elements of the theory of change for which there's no substantive evidence yet. Relevant variables that should be included in data collection, intermediate outcomes that can be used as markers of success in situations where the impacts of interest will not occur during the time frame, aspects of implementation that should be examined, and then potentially relevant contextual factors that should be addressed. So there is an example for female genital mutilation and cutting where this was actually applied to successfully. And we can kind of see where this was applied diagrammatically, and this provides some examples of this. So we can kind of take a look at where this was. I know I'm trying to get to the figure, but before we do that, let me do this first. Let me go over the types of change and give you some examples. So there's individual change, which is transformative change of a critical mass of individuals. So this is like investment in individual change through training. Maybe this is consciousness raising, self-actualization, personal transformation, dialogues and encounter groups, trauma healing. Then there's health relationships and connections. So breakdown, isolation, polarization, division, all these things. Prejudice, stereotypes between among groups, break these down. Process of intergroup dialogue, networking, relationship building processes, joint efforts and practical programs on substantive problems. Then there's root causes injustice. So that addresses underlying issues of injustice, oppression, exploitation, threats to identity and security, and people's sense of injury victimization. So this is long-term campaigns. Interventions include long-term campaigns for social and structural change. These types of interventions are about truth and reconciliation, changes in social institutions, laws, regulations, and economic systems. These are the types of interventions. So again, on the right, these are the interventions for the theories of change, or the types of change. So if we're talking about the institutional development, it's important to establish stability and reliable social institutions that guarantee not only democracy, but equity, justice, and fair allocation of resources. So the interventions that work there is new institutional and governance arrangements, entities, development of human rights, rule of law, anti-corruption, establishment of democratic, equitable economic structures, decentralization. This is what will allow for institutional development. And then if you want grassroots mobilization with change there, mobilizing the community so that politicians have to pay attention, then you can mobilize a lot of grassroots groups through social media and different places. Nonviolent direct action campaigns are always wonderful. Calls to action, use of other media, education, mobilization efforts, and advocacy groups. So these are all the different types of changes. Again, the main results chain is inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and then impact. So now this goes into some of the specifics of improved well-being, social development, long-term poverty reduction, pro-poor, and inclusive economic growth. And this is in the form of kind of the logic model that we traditionally are familiar with. And I'm going to quickly just go over the activities, selection process, grant administration and payment, the outputs, which are the actual unconditional, and then to caregivers and on a monthly basis, and then expenditure. And that's intra-household power structures and intra-household allocation. And so take a look at the difference between that. And those are the short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes of some of these interventions and activities. So these are the theories of change for the child support grant. So the next one is detailed theories of change showing multiple causal pathways and availability of supporting evidence for female genital mutilation and cutting. And that's what I was getting at before. And it starts with the activities. There's a joint program that contributes to the process of change through the following types of activities. Coordinating, maintaining, creating networks and partnership, advocacy, policy dialogue, resource mobilization, capacity development. So just on the ground training, technical support, systems building, and support South-South cooperation. And really important, this is that support to communication, sensitization, and awareness raising. So support to community, education, dialogue, and community-led initiatives and data and knowledge generation, management, and circulation. So these are the activities that will result in, and this is not just for female genital mutilation. This will actually be true for some other types of changes as well, other types of global health initiatives as well. So at the short term, you have key steps in the process of collective social change. And that is strengthening community education, dialogue and decision making, engagement of traditional and religious leaders. This is really important. People that still hold on to the practice and the belief system that this is an important part of initiation and the rite of passage. Engagement of the media, and engagement of reproductive healthcare providers and other influential actors. Across communities, what is needed is collective social change, which is accelerated and sustained by organized diffusion of the decision to abandon the practice among intermarrying groups, and strengthening sub-regional dialogue and exchange and engagement of the media. At the national level, what is needed is an enabling environment which is built and strengthening coordinating systems, intervention strategy, lengthening policy reform, and strengthening legal reform, and capacities that strengthen national stakeholders, media campaigns, etc. And then, of course, at the global level, there's a specific approach that's needed for a production and circulation of knowledge. Then at the medium term, there's a commitment to abandon the practice altogether. And if it reaches a critical mass of people within the community and across the borders, then it will stop altogether. A more enabling national environment is really needed that will enforce a legal framework against FGM. and the existence and implementation of evidence-based policy strategies, programs, and plans supporting the abandonment of FGM. And more enabling global and regional environments that can support efforts. So this is all leading kind of to the same thing, but looking at different phases. So in the long term, then the changes in the relevant social norms result, hopefully, changing in the individual and collective behaviors altogether of FGM, and changing in abandonment. Very detailed, but I think if you go through this, if you take a little bit of opportunity and go through this, this can provide really good insight. This is more simplified version of theory of change, and theory of change again is focused on why. This is focusing on why. Starting, if you start at one broad variety of contextually tailored sets of interventions involving and targeting different actors and groupings through various channels, that leads to changes in access to services, changes in legal and policy frameworks, changes in collective individual knowledge and attitude, changes in public discourse. So what is important really here to look at this triangle figure is to look at the fact that one is leading to the other, social norms, and then leading to the individual behaviors, leading to changes in prevalence. So how one change leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next, whatever the subject matter may be. That's what's important. Contextual influences, of course, are always very high. So in terms of political instability, if that's there, then these things would be different. Political ideological agendas, of course, that influences this economic situation. Diffuse influences, like for instance through internet, somewhere where people are getting their ideas, and through social media, of course, and then capacities of actors and institutions, that plays a role. If you want to know a good way to do a certain type of study, a quasi-experimental study design, propensity score matching is an interesting technique, which I encourage each and every one of you to take a look into separately. But this example 2 goes into the theory of change application and explaining program failure in the impact evaluation of the Bangladesh Integrated Nutrition Program. So this is some nutritional counseling and supplemental feeding that was to malnourished population that didn't really affect well, and didn't really result in change. So this goes through some of the different parts of this model. So you can take a look at this, and then there's some examples of challenges and gaps. Failure to actually have a theory about how change occurs. So many log frames logic models they do not really actually explain how a program policy is understood to work. So a lot of these theories of change are inadequate to guide any impact evaluation. So it's important to try to embed a theory of change within any sort of logic model framework. And then there's sometimes gaps in the theory of change, and training. The trainer model will seek to improve teachers' knowledge of teaching, of different teaching methods. And then we're left with some resources to go through if you wanted to understand this, and then the glossary goes through the definition of some words. So if you have any questions, of course, you can kind of go back to this paper and refer back to this paper. Thank you for listening.